A working paper published by the World Bank says that poverty, that is extreme poverty in India, has declined by 12.3% in the years between 2011 and 2019. Now, this report comes just days after a working paper was published on the IMF site, which made similar claims, which in fact claimed that India has almost eradicated extreme poverty. Now, there are a lot of claims like these which are being questioned by some economists. Others are upholding and applauding the kind of progress India has made. But it's interesting to see how far they go. Do these working papers and their claims of eradication nearly or a sharp reduction of extreme poverty reflect what we see around us? To speak on this, I am joined now by Madan Sabnavis, Chief Economist of the Bank of Baroda. Siddhartha Sanyal, Chief Economist and Head Research, Bandhan Bank, is with us on the show. And I'm also speaking with Madhvi, Arora, Lead Economist at Emkay Global. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for speaking with us this evening on ET Now. Siddhartha, let me begin by just getting your view on the latest paper, the World Bank paper, which also says that rural poverty has decreased faster than urban poverty. On the face of it, do you agree with the methodology and the reasoning given by its authors?
It's indeed true that if you think about extreme poverty, there has actually been a reduction in that over the course of the last 10 odd years. Now, there had been newer avenues of job and employment, not necessarily the formal sector job, but some bit of additional sources of employment that has come upstream. Also, there has been quite a bit of focused programs, especially in case of trying to support the rural poor from the government side, both from the state governments as well as from the central government has been there over the course of the last decade or so. So overall, it's not very surprising that absolute poverty or extreme poverty has actually has moved lower over the course of the last about 10 years. However, one should be very careful of one particular fact. My sense is that very clearly, even during this period, overall inequality in the economy can still be rising. But that doesn't mean that...
this paper, the World Bank working paper actually says that inequality is at its lowest levels in 40 years, and it attributes this to state-provided food handouts. Madan, let me bring you in on this issue, and then I'll come very quickly to why some of these papers and some of these methods of calculation are being questioned. But on the face of it, what the World Bank working paper says, or the research paper says, and what the IMF paper says, do you agree on the basic premise?
See, actually, the way one looks at poverty, it's all based on the discretion of the evaluator. Okay, I think that's the benefit which all economists have, because I define poverty in a certain way, I define extreme poverty in a certain way, and then accordingly I put the data together into it. We should remember one thing, that everything is based on interpretation of data. It's not a case of actually carrying out any kind of a survey across a large population to really see in case poverty levels have come up or come down. Actually, if we step out of our own homes, we have seen both in the rural as well as in urban areas that the level of deprivation is still very high. There are, of course, there's a lot of improvement which has taken place in the standard of living of people, which cannot be contested. If you say the kind of access people have to mobile phones, I think that's usually given as evidence to show that people are not really that poor in case they can afford to have a phone. That's very much true. But ultimately, at the end of the day, in case we are able to move out of this so-called deprivation levels, there should be less dependence on the state. So when we have a lockdown, if we are really out of poverty, then I do not require to get free food from the government. If I do require free food, and I believe that what the government has done has been exemplary, because we'd have been in a very wretched situation if that was not done. This also actually counter-argues and says that conditions were not that good to begin with. Similarly, in case we do not have this kind of deprivation levels, then our consumption should be going up, which is not happening. So that's a problem which has been acknowledged, I think, even in the official circles, that consumption is something which has been held back. And that's essentially because of the second point which you have raised on inequality. In fact, interestingly, I think you're talking of World Bank and IMF the other day, I think yesterday or so, I was looking at the Global Inequality Report, which actually says that the inequality levels are quite abysmal, because we see what is owned by the bottom 10%, the top 10%, the bottom 50%. There's a huge difference out there. If I say that inequality is such that around 3.5% of overall wealth is being held by 50% of the population, I don't think that does too much of credit to this entire thing about poverty coming down and we are out of the woods.
Two different things.
Really
Madan, I get your point completely, but there are two different sets of claims. One is about inequality widening, which we can actually see all around us. The second point is this is a claim that extreme poverty, defined loosely as $1.89 a day, if I'm not mistaken, or thereabouts, has one claim is been near eradicated, and the second claim is reduced about 12% in the last decade or so. Let me come to Madhvi on this. So in that specific context, and of course we'll come to inequality because that's the big question, what does extreme poverty really mean? Do you think the question over here is also being raised because of how extreme poverty is being defined and whether that's still a relevant yardstick to go by?
No, I think the most important thing to really see here is that they've used, especially the IMF paper has, the World Bank paper, sorry, has used the CMI survey data as their base, which is not, I mean, technically speaking, not a very nationally representative data. And obviously they have used their own consumption measures or consumption expenditure measures to define the, extreme poverty. Obviously one has to then probably widen it to nutrition, food nutrition as well, which to my understanding, if they have taken, they've taken their own measure, would have improved, because then it is not necessarily comparable to the NSSO measure of consumption, which Sujit Bhalla's paper has also used. So I think they have a very different approach to defining abject poverty. But I understand that the extreme level of poverty, at least when you see in a more casual fashion, might have actually improved. But again, it's questionable as to how they have defined it. So I think both the papers have taken different measures and different definitions as well as different databases to come to the conclusion. But that said, again, this data is until 2019, which means that it doesn't really take into consideration the post-COVID period, which obviously has changed the global dynamics as far as inequality is concerned. Poverty, not so much, but probably inequality, yes, there has been a wealth consolidation. So clearly the inequality across the world has increased, which has been the case in every crisis. Every crisis generally tends to increase inequality in general.
Do you buy the claim? Do you agree with the claim, number one, that extreme poverty has been nearly eradicated? And number two, that extreme poverty, because both papers talk about extreme poverty, have dropped 12% between 2011 and 2019, which the authors contextualize by saying it's less than what was previously claimed.
So that's what I'm saying. So clearly there have been, rural development plans that the government has targeted, especially the food transfers and the NREGA, which finally may have percolated down. But I think that if I'm talking about the rural, terms of trade, they in the last 7 to 8 years have actually worsened, partly because of lower food inflation, and partly also because the real wages, the rural sector have actually been in a negative zone for a longest period, I think, except for the last 1.5 years or so. So I'm not too sure whether, I'm not in a condition to really, question them in terms of how they materialized it.
Yeah.
But, if you go by the broad measures, both of them are at least suggesting the same thing, that at least until 2019, partly because of the rural development focus of the government of India, there could have been some better percolation of, distribution of economic benefits in general.
Yeah. So clearly these are academic papers, but the issue of poverty in India and any claim that, something has been done to eradicate poverty will quickly, if not already, become a political slogan, which will have claims and counterclaims. I mean, that's a matter of time. So in that context, Siddhartha Sanyal, there are a lot of people who've come out and questioned the methodology, at least in the IMF paper to start with. The other papers just, come out in the public domain. Do you think that those points are valid?
That's always an issue, Tamanna, as Madan also very clearly said in his comments, that in case of this kind of measures like poverty, it depends a lot how exactly you try to define it, whether you try to go for some kind of calorie value, or you are trying to pinpoint certain level of absolute income, or you try to see some anecdotal evidence in terms of widespread anecdotal evidence, possibly in terms of what we get to see in terms of, the standard of living. So my sense is that in terms of most, almost all approaches, we will get to see that on an absolute scale, there has been quite a bit of improvement so far as absolute poverty is concerned, or extreme poverty is concerned. But very, very clearly, my sense is that I'll differ on that particular claim, that inequality has come down. Inequality seemed to be quite strong, and even though absolute level of poverty has gone down a bit, there is very, very clearly a lot to be done. And that particular point is also very valid, that at this moment, you possibly need to see that this reduction in poverty, to what extent they are dependent on government support. Because at this moment, especially over the last 10 odd years, there had been an increasing trend of very strong support from various state governments in terms of support to the poorer section of that particular respective state. So this particular factor needs to be taken into account, and a very appropriate measure might be that stripping out the government support part, how poverty is really moving.
Yeah, so, that's an important point, Madan. Do you think it's important to look at this minus what the government has been doing, or look at it in the context that, yes, India has gone through a tough time? We are a nation state that requires government to step in for a large number of poor people in absolute terms. So should we look at it from the point of view that, yes, perhaps these schemes are finally working to eradicate at least extreme poverty, which looks at things as malnutrition, not having enough food, etc.?
No, actually, I think the point that Siddharth has raised is very pertinent, because when you're talking of government intervention, you look at a PM Kisan scheme, you look at an Arora scheme, it's just basically a case of cash transfers. So I think if you're giving cash transfers and then saying that, look, I'm out of extreme poverty, it is, of course, an achievement. And I think definitely people have gotten out of it. But the important part is, how long can this be sustained? So is it a case of saying that I'm going to make sure that a person who has come out of extreme poverty does again slip into extreme poverty once these kind of benefits are withdrawn? So I think what is important is to create sustainable income for people, which can only be done through job creation. And what we have seen in India is that a so-called trickle-down process, where it was supposed to be large industry which brought about growth, and then as it kept growing, there would be a tendency for more people to be employed, and accordingly people would be driven out of poverty. Agriculture becomes more commercialized. I think this kind of a story has worked only to a certain extent. There is still a lot of dependence on not just the central government, but also the state government. And while there's one section of we economists ourselves who keep saying that don't give freebies, but we should remember that if the freebies weren't given, people would actually be under extreme poverty. And I also agree with you, Tamanna, that probably in the kind of country that we are, we would be requiring a lot of these freebies to be given at least at this particular level, because we need to help out people if you're not able to find them jobs. So we do require this direct support to be given. But ultimately, if they have to be self-sustaining, we do need to create more jobs. And I think that's always been the crux which we've not been able to crack so far.
Okay, let me come to the question of inequality, and let's contextualize it to what we are experiencing right now. Madhvi, let me come to you on this. So I think inequality and the widening inequality due to COVID-19 has been well documented, has been talked about a lot. And now we're in a situation where we have 2 years of COVID and are staring at high inflation. We saw that in the CPI numbers last week. The WPI numbers today show that we've been in double-digit wholesale price inflation for nearly a year, or a little more than a year. So what kind of an impact is this going to have on the parameter of poverty?
No, I think again it sort of worsens the terms of trade, especially for the rural sector, because whatever benefit that they may be getting out of a higher agricultural inflation that one is seeing globally, and which could also percolate down to the Indian economy as well, which would mean that terms of trade on a broader basis would look good for the agri segment. But in the end, the kind of service inflation that they still have to pay in the rural sector, or a non-food inflation that they are going to be charged, ultimately implies that even with a higher input, that higher inflation, which is probably improving the terms of trade, on net basis, they're still going to be suffering because of high generic inflation that the country is facing. So I think to that extent, the so-called inequality debate may only improve at the margin as far as the rural sector is concerned, even with the higher agri inflation that you're seeing for the year ahead.
Just an outlook on the impact of inflation going forward on the poverty parameter, Siddharth?
Of course, inflation, especially if it is consumer price inflation, it hits the poorest section the hardest. And given that we are right now seeing very a clear possibility of pretty entrenched and high level of inflation for a fairly long period of time, that's a clear risk. I'd also try to complete one particular thought process that we were kind of hinting at earlier, that what kind of support in the extreme poor section the government is extending. Is it only freebies like food grains and some of the food grains and clothes, etc., which is very much needed for that particular segment? But also, is there any possibility of them getting some kind of income generating asset, whatever small that can be maybe a few hands, or that can be possibly a small sewing machine, whether we are getting that kind of support or all pure consumption support. And if it is pure consumption kind of support, then the difficulty in terms of, the challenges in terms of eradicating extreme poverty over a period of time becomes all the more difficult. If there is some support in terms of some income generating asset, again, at whatever small they might be, that possibly goes a long way in terms of reducing extreme poverty in a much more sustainable way. I am aware of a few programs at a private sector initiative toward that direction. But from the government, there is limit in terms of scaling that up across the country. But a government initiative in that direction might actually be a lot more impactful in terms of reducing extreme poverty in a more sustained way.
Yeah. Madan, just closing comments on what the learnings are from some of these observations, and they will be questioned depending on how they make which government look, whether they make, the current government look good or bad or better. But in terms of actually making a difference, one of the points which has been suggested, in fact, by the authors of the IMF working paper is to change how we define poverty and increase the daily income flow as a parameter. Do you think there's merit to that point?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is the ultimate thing. And more importantly, I think we should have a larger sample which we're looking at. So one is, of course, I don't know if $1.9 per day is actually something which will keep one above keep dead above the ground. But definitely we need to have more kind of sample surveys carried out to really see whether we are measuring poverty right. Because right now, if it's an academic exercise where I keep picking up piles of data and extrapolating another set of pile on one pile, then I think we could be coming up with different kind of conclusions. And that's what I said, that is the author's prerogative. And that's what economists are good for doing. And it's, of course, very much useful because they are indicative. Otherwise, we would have absolutely no idea about what's happening. So they are useful. But I think that at the government level, there should be certain surveys carried out, both in terms of employment as well as in terms of poverty, that is income levels, so that we get closer towards it. It's a mammoth exercise. It's not easy given the size of the population and the way you have
I
to
think,
go
yes, the missing piece of the puzzle is definitely inequity, inequality, and how you define poverty. Is it just, avoiding malnutrition? And can we go further than that right now? Thank you so much to all of you for joining us on this very important discussion this evening.